More importantly, I think, what we've seen in places like Nigeria and now South Sudan is the multiplication of counties or the multiplication of states as a means of answering, of possibly
a political
hiding
kind of a thing,
yes, and also notionally dealing with aspirations of smaller groups and people like that. I can't speak about whether that's effective or not. I know that it doesn't lead only to peace in Nigeria, certainly not. But here we have a situation where if you look at places like the coast,
it's all political in the case of South
Sudan. The coast
Sudan,
was talking about secession. On November 1st, 2017, Governors Joho, and Kingi, and Senator Stuart Mazzeo from Khalifi had a press conference where they announced coast secession. And we do know historically that the coastal area, which they included the hinterlands, of course, not just the 10-mile strip along the coast, which was a protectorate, didn't really have a full vote, if you will, in joining Kenya. It was an arrangement because the new colony or the new independent Kenya did need a coastline. Okay, but when they had that press conference, they were actually discussing self-determination of the coastal region. At the same time, you may remember Honorable Kaluma introduced a bill, secession for Western Kenya, or whatever. You know, the secessionist impulses can only, in fact, be encouraged by these regional blocs, particularly of areas where they believe, and that's Northeast Kenya too.
I think more than anything else, what basically informed those kind of, I wouldn't call them desperate, but extreme measures on the part of the Western people, Kenya and the Coast Province and every other region, was the notion that was put into executive practice of the sharing of the country 50-50 between Kalenjins and Kikuyus.
Yes.
And basically it's like, you know, you have it for the Kalenjin and then you have it for the Kikuyu. And if we're going to be eternally, not slaves, but basically subjects for these two communities, we might as well secede.
Well, these
so in other words, it was, look, there is no fairness in this union. Because there's no fairness in this union, and the resources are being shared 50-50 between these two, the rest of it is just symbolic for the rest of the country, so we might as well talk
And
about
at the
secession.
time, these were ODM politicians who had just seen the election taken away.
But I don't think deep down in the minds of any of the Kenyan communities seriously considered that. Of course, that can only come out of a protracted, maintained alienation from the center. And that, my fear that would be not for the other parts of Kenya, but even in the case of the North had those notions at some stage that we'll never have fairness in here. We'll just be subjects or slaves for these people.
Well, I think we've agreed, however, that in Northeast Kenya there has been an alienation of people historically, and now Al-shabaab is reducing the influence of the national government.
No, let me just explain. Al-shabaab is hated by them, so they hate Al-shabaab more than anybody else. With all the imperfections of the center here, and the fact that the center is not taking adequately care of the people in the north, but still, because of the sessional paper number 10 of 1965, which basically talked about intensification of government resources in the high potential areas, as opposed to extensification, which left us out completely.
Yes, because those high potential areas were the ones that colonials.
So basically, even with that, like all people who live in extremely harsh conditions, you tend to become much more aggressive and much more productive. The Somali society, by and large, has integrated seamlessly and powerfully into the mainstream of the society, whether it is in economy or in the government or in business. And so the last thing a Somali thinks about today is what's called secession. That's not there. Of course, there is need to do better. There is need for the government, because so far we've been doing things on our own. So far we've been doing things on our own. And when they talk about Somalis taking over Kenya, which is a common, what do you call, a statement that's bandied around, it's because every time there's a drought, there are 200,000 Somalis who get displaced in those areas. And the only place they can come to is the high potential areas, because they said all the resources will be in the high potential, so they come to the places where the resources are. You get my point?
Yes.
So those are the kind of things. The way to try and stave off that kind of constant migration into the centers here is to create a lot of opportunities in the periphery.
Right.
And to begin with, let's start with security.
Yes.
Let's start with infrastructure. These are the kind of things they're looking for. But by and large, no Somali. A Somali would be the last person to want to secede from this country.
But see, when you mentioned infrastructure...
For the very simple reason, you know, okay, at some stage, we've had 130 years of history as part of Kenya. And this is you throw me right now into Somalia, and there's very little I'm going to understand about it.
That's true.
And that basically is the situation we have now.
Now, you mentioned infrastructure.
It's like an American Jew like you. And if you had a choice to go and settle in Israel for good, you would have to give it a second thought about it.
At least 2 or 3
I grew
times.
up in Brooklyn.
Yes, in Queens. No, but you see, when you talk about infrastructure, we know now the President Kenyatta is in Washington, as is the Prime Minister, Raila Odinga, head of infrastructure for the AU. And there is talk now of a free trade agreement to be negotiated over the next 4 or 5 years.
Between the two
Kenya.
countries.
Yes, but when you look at the Kenyan government desire to establish yet another superhighway between Mombasa and Nairobi, and Bechtel was supposed to, the U.S. construction giant, was supposed to get that contract. I believe that Ambassador McCarter put a stop to it because of the incredible padding, the extra money that was in that whole deal, even though it was a U.S. company.
Corruption.
But that kind of $3 billion project, if Bechtel were given the assignment to construct all-weather roads, put up a Somalia border control mechanism to rehabilitate all of the airstrips, because they have done this, for better or worse, in Iraq, in Afghanistan and elsewhere. They have an entire, their portfolio would allow them.
The road from Garissa to Mandera,
and
another one to Liboy across the border.
Exactly, and also up through Lamu, all the way to the Somalia border.
It will be history.
The fact is,
Al-shabaab will be history.
Yes, and it also allows the security forces to patrol adequately, more effectively.
Absolutely.
It allows teachers to come and go.
Rapid deployment.
Yes.
You just rush them there on
And
the tarmac road. You cannot put the AEDs on the tarmac.
Yeah.
You drop them there, and there they go and chase them by foot.
And the fact is that Bechtel would have no difficulty putting fences along the border and everything else, and doing the airstrips, the all-weather road. Well, I'm a big fan of watchtowers, which brings me to the notion that one of the things since we started talking about the Lamu attack, do you know we don't even know if there were watchtowers at Manda Bay?
I'm surprised.
And yet we know there are watchtowers at the Army camp across from ABC Place on Wayaki Way. There's a watchtower.
Anytime you have an army base somewhere,
and it is covered with
I have no
camouflage
doubt in
netting.
my mind there must be watchtowers.
And there are at least 2 or 3 of them, and in Hurlingham, at the Army, the Ministry of Defense headquarters.
Big, massive lights that you basically.
Well, they don't actually. I've never
seen
seen lights up there. I've seen them. You know, they've got the watchtowers.
Well, this is an urban setting, but of course.
But it's interesting that we have.
Lights,
there should be, but you shoot those out. But we have watchtowers in an urban setting in Hurlingham that are covered with camouflage netting to make them look like bushes. But we don't know
if we
had watchtowers, and I'm convinced
I'm sure
that
I'm sure they have them. Those are very basic, rudimentary security arrangements that I doubt they would.
Then the question is, were they manned at the morning of the attack? Was anybody in the watchtower?
People were sleeping on the job. There's no doubt about it.
Yes, that's true. And so we end up with a situation where 1 month after the attack, there are still more questions than answers. And the questions go to a lot of people's careers, including Americans. It goes to what the heck were they doing there? Was the surveillance, the intelligence gathering and surveillance, was that shared regularly with the Kenyans? And if not, why not? Because we do know that NIS has shared information with the police who have failed to react. So we shouldn't really have this much controversy over the basic facts of what took place from 5:30 a.m. on January 5th.
To what time?
It took about 2, I think it took 5 or 6 hours, 7 hours to adequately clear the entire camp.
And did they parade any Al-shabaab bodies?
They showed pictures of 6 or 8 dead people in camouflage, but we've never seen the photographs up close. We don't know. We also, I'm sure, however, I believe that with the reaction force that came in from Djibouti, that the scene was secured because there's a lot of classified material in those aircraft and on the base. And that's all been spirited away. We don't know if anything's been replaced because those airplanes have to be ordered. And yes, it's a bureaucracy. American procurement can be very slow. Thing is, though, we still have nobody talking about the role of the KDF in defending a KDF base within the borders of Kenya.
One thing, if we do have tweaking a little bit of the devolution arrangement in the country and are looking at some kind of a superstructures instead of 47 counties, different devolved units, we have 14, 15, 16. And then, of course, we collapse some of these counties together into one unit with one head, and maybe have the sub whatever counties, which is in whatever we're going to call them. Would you favor that kind of an arrangement to benefit the economics of scale, the economics of scale in this case?
Well, you see, it's a simple question to answer because it's in the Constitution. So we have to amend the Constitution to reduce the number. And now we're introducing.
We'll have to go for a referendum, of course. Yes.
Yes, and we had the last referendum we had, of course, was 4th August 2010. So the talk about referenda now in June or July means that we will have a lost decade. We will have another referendum.
Well, basically, we will have a decade in which we learn so much from a very good constitution, and that we will. You have amended your constitution 38, 39 times, or 37
Actually,
times.
We've amended it
37 times, I think.
You know,
We
over 250
we are
years.
now in 60 years into, or 60 years into our own independence. So amending it a second time or a third time is not such a big deal.
It's in this
but
case
let
seems
me
to be more of a
let me
Pandora's
ask
box.
you one more pointed
Sure.
question. Having seen your friend and your president, Donald
Yes.
Trump, and how the presidency has divided, we're not the only ones who are divided, how the presidency has divided American people and nation, 400 million people, right across the middle. And would you still, looking at the British system and looking at all others, the Chancellor of Germany and a number of other prime ministers, and how in Europe, except in the case of France, many of them also use the parliamentary system and they have a prime minister as the head of the government. Would you favor, and the kind of conflicts we go through every time we have a presidential election in the country, because it's an imperial presidency, just like Trump is what we have here. Would you favor a parliamentary system in Kenya and maybe by extension even your own America?
Well, you know, I've lived here for more
For
than half
30 odd years,
for
yes.
38 years.
Yes, yes.
So I'm no longer
An American as much as here.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, what's happened in the last 3 years with Trump is a phenomenon that's most unfortunate from my point of view. It represents a divisiveness in America that we haven't really seen enunciated.
And he's likely to win the elections, I'm told.
It's very likely because they're focusing again on the Electoral College. The Electoral College was designed to prevent the imperial president. They were designed. It was designed to allow smaller states to speak out. Now we're in a situation where half the population in America, voters, and Americans don't vote, by the way. Less than 60% of all eligible voters are registered to vote, and we have elections where, you know,
and out of that 60%, probably
maybe
another
half,
60% is the one who
60% will come out to vote.
will vote.
Yes, and so you.
You're
and if
looking
you
at an
shave it-
overall 30, less than 50%
Yes.
of Americans vote.
Very-
Eligible voters.
That's true, and you know, but we have very powerful governors. We have very powerful mayors. We have a lot of devolved functions that where Americans don't see themselves in Washington as such a big deal. But Donald Trump's base is in what they call the flyover states. But if you assemble enough of these states that have 5 electoral votes, and you grab a couple of big states, Michigan or Pennsylvania, Florida, you end up with the 270 votes you need in the Electoral
California.
College to win. Well, California is never going to go for Trump. But what this means is that whoever gets the Democratic nomination is going to have to waste a lot of time and money in all these little states, because it's not about getting out the vote in California, because the Democrats can count on California, pretty much count on New York as far as the electoral votes. It's how much time can you spend campaigning again in the general election in Kansas, in Iowa,
Wyoming, Montana.
North Dakota, South Dakota. You know, this is a very serious. This
Electoral
will,
colleges are small.
and that's why the funding of our elections, which is still basically private and corporate,
Iowa.
means that the more
Maine.
money you have, you can spend for opening offices to get out the vote in those states. You see, the last time there was a genuinely contested Electoral College vote was in 2000 when Bush ran against Gore, because in many of the states, in New Mexico, the popular vote was so close that the electoral votes could have gone either way if 5,000 votes were changed. And this also unfortunately means, and this is a bad lesson for Kenya and everybody else to learn.
Winner take all.
Not just winner take all, but voter suppression in the United States. Suppressing members of minority groups.
If you get 50.6% in a what you call the majoritarian rule, where it's a system of elections,
yes.
50 plus 50.05% in California, then you get the whole electoral college for that. Why not get just 50 plus something percent of the electoral college?
Well, there is one state now where they divide up the electoral votes.
That's the point.
Because the states are allowed to do that.
Yes.
But you see, this is a long, drawn-out process of even doing that. And you see, if you have a state where you have a Republican-controlled legislature, they're not going to vote to do that. We have seen a situation now growing in the United States 50 years after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, where things are being done in any number of states to prevent African-American, Latino voters from actually
voting.
being able to vote. And as a lifelong Republican...
Emancipation.
Well, as a lifelong Republican, I find it appalling what's happened, although I have to say mea culpa. Republicans always used to hope for rain on Election Day because Republicans have cars and people of color did not have cars.
I'm surprised, one thing.